It's strange how the quiet moments in life can carry so much weight. That night, I didn't think twice about staying behind to clean up. Leonard had already left, tired and grumbling about his back, and Jeremy had offered to stay and help. It seemed innocent enough, two people finishing a long day's work. But by the time the tables were cleared and the lights were dimmed, something had shifted. My name is Victoria Hargrave, and I'm 56 years old. I've been married to Leonard for 12 years, and for most of that time I've dedicated myself to our small event planning business. It's not glamorous work, but it's fulfilling in its own way. Leonard's son, Jeremy, is 30. He's been living with us for the past few months after being laid off, and while he's always been polite, there's a distance between us. He's never quite forgiven his father for remarrying so soon after his mother's death, and I've always been careful not to overstep my boundaries. That night, though, something changed. It was the kind of moment that sneaks up on you, quiet and unassuming, until it's too late to turn back. This is the story of how one late night changed everything, and how the choices I made that night unraveled the life I thought I knew. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment my marriage to Leonard started to feel like an arrangement rather than a partnership. Maybe it was the third time he left me to deal with a disgruntled client because he'd rather focus on perfecting his golf swing. Or maybe it was when he stopped asking how my day went and started grunting in acknowledgement instead. To outsiders, our marriage probably looked fine. Comfortable, even. Leonard and I shared a decent life, a modestly successful event planning business, a lovely home in a quiet suburb, and the kind of predictability that some people might envy. But beneath the surface, there was a void that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. That void became more pronounced when Jeremy moved back in. Jeremy was Leonard's son from his first marriage, a handsome but guarded man of 30 who carried himself with a quiet intensity. He had his mother's dark hair and sharp features, but his temperament was more like Leonard's, stoic and occasionally sharp-tongued. When I first met Jeremy years ago, he'd been polite but distant, shaking my hand with a perfunctory smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Over the years, we'd shared little more than pleasantries, and I'd always felt like I was walking on eggshells around him. So, when Leonard told me Jeremy was moving in for a while after losing his job, I was apprehensive, to say the least. It's just until he gets back on his feet, Leonard had assured me, as though that would make the transition any easier. Of course, I'd said, forcing a smile, he's family. But family was a complicated word in our household. Jeremy moved into the guest room with little fanfare, bringing only a couple of suitcases and a distant air that made it clear he wasn't thrilled to be there. I tried to make him feel welcome, cooking his favorite meals and asking about his plans, but his responses were always short and guarded. "Thanks," he'd say when I served dinner, or, "not sure yet," when I asked about his job prospects. Leonard, for his part, seemed content to leave Jeremy to his own devices. He'd occasionally offer vague words of encouragement, "You'll land on your feet, son," before retreating to his office or the golf course. That left me to navigate the awkwardness of living with a stepson who seemed more like a house guest than family. The family reunion event was Leonard's idea, part of his ongoing effort to maintain appearances as the patriarch of a close-knit family. It was also, predictably, left to me to plan. Just something simple. Leonard had said when he first floated the idea, a barbecue, maybe. Nothing too fancy. But nothing Leonard ever asked for was truly simple. The guest list ballooned from 10 people to 30, and what started as a casual barbecue morphed into a full-blown catered affair, complete with rented tables and decorations. Jeremy, to my surprise, offered to help. "I've got time," he said when I asked if he'd be willing to pitch in. "Might as well make myself useful." I was skeptical at first, but he proved to be more capable than I'd expected. He helped set up tables, string lights across the backyard, and even wrangled the caterers when they arrived late. "You're a natural at this," I said at one point, handing him a glass of water as we stood by the grill. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess I learned a thing or two from my mom. She loved hosting parties." The mention of his mother caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "She would have liked you," he added after a moment, his tone softening. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or a strange sense of validation. "Thank you," I said quietly. The day of the reunion was a blur of activity. Guests arrived in droves, filling the backyard with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Leonard basked in the attention, regaling everyone with stories about his time in the military and his semi-retirement as a businessman. Jeremy, meanwhile, slipped into the background, helping out wherever he was needed without drawing attention to himself. "You've raised a good son," one of Leonard's cousins said to me at one point, mistaking my role in Jeremy's life. I smiled politely, resisting the urge to correct her. By the time the last guest left, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the backyard was littered with empty plates and crumpled napkins. Leonard predictably excused himself to lie down for a bit, leaving Jeremy and me to handle the cleanup. "I can do this on my own," I said as I started stacking plates. "It's fine," Jeremy replied, grabbing a trash bag. "I don't mind." For a while, we worked in silence, the occasional clink of glass or rustle of trash the only sounds breaking the stillness. "You're good at this," I said after a while, nodding toward the string of fairy lights he was carefully taking down. He shrugged. "It's just cleanup." "No, I mean, you're good with people, organizing things. You have a natural knack for it." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, that's nice to hear." As the night wore on, the atmosphere between us shifted. It was subtle at first, a shared laugh when I tripped over a stray chair, a fleeting glance that lingered a second too long. "Why do you put up with him?" Jeremy asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "My dad," he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite identify. "He doesn't exactly make your life easy." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "He's not a bad man," I said finally. "He just has his flaws." Jeremy snorted. "That's putting it lightly." I set down the plates I was holding, crossing my arms over my chest. "He's your father," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "And he loves you." "Maybe," Jeremy replied, his gaze dropping to the ground. "But he sure has a funny way of showing it." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt an inexplicable urge to comfort him. "You're allowed to be angry," I said softly. "But don't let it consume you. You're better than that." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else I couldn't quite name. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Then, almost instinctively, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to be okay, Jeremy," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he believed me. By the time we finished cleaning up, the clock on the kitchen wall read 11:42 p.m. The house was eerily quiet, with Leonard long since retired to the bedroom and the lingering hum of voices from the reunion fading into memory. Jeremy and I stood in the kitchen, the countertop between us piled with dishes waiting to be washed. "You should head to bed," I said, gesturing toward the hallway. "I can finish this up." Jeremy shook his head, wiping his hands on a towel. "You've done enough for one day. Let me help." There was no point in arguing. Once Jeremy made up his mind about something, he didn't budge, a trait I admired even if it occasionally frustrated me. "Suit yourself," I said, grabbing a sponge and turning on the faucet. We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the sound of running water and clinking dishes filling the space between us. Every now and then, our hands brushed as we reached for the same plate or utensil, and each time I felt a strange jolt of awareness. "You know," Jeremy said after a while, his voice breaking the quiet, "tonight wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be." I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, and what were you expecting?" he smirked, shrugging. "Lots of awkward small talk, people asking me what I'm doing with my life, the usual." I laughed softly, setting a clean glass on the drying rack. "You handled it well." "Thanks," he said, his tone sincere. "But that's mostly because of you." I blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Yeah," he said, rinsing a plate. "You kept things running smoothly, made everyone feel welcome. You've got a way of making things easier." For a moment I didn't know how to respond. "That's kind of you to say," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "It's just the truth." The air between us shifted then, becoming heavier, more charged. I busied myself with the dishes, my heart pounding as I tried to ignore the way his words made me feel. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly. I frowned, looking up. "Tired of what?" "Doing everything for everyone," he said, gesturing toward the pile of dishes. "Keeping this place running, putting up with my dad. Doesn't it ever get to you?" His question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But that's just how life is, isn't it? You do what needs to be done." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "That's not how it should be. You deserve more than that." The intensity in his voice made my breath catch, and for a moment I couldn't look away from him. "Jeremy," I began, but the words faltered on my tongue. The sound of a glass slipping from his hand and clattering into the sink broke the tension. "Sorry," he muttered, his cheeks flushing as he reached for the glass. "It's fine," I said quickly, grateful for the distraction. But the moment lingered, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. We finished the dishes in silence, the weight of our earlier conversation hanging over us like a cloud. When the last plate was put away, I turned to him, wiping my hands on a towel. "Thank you for staying to help," I said, my voice steadier now. He nodded, leaning against the counter. "Of course, I couldn't just leave you to do it all." I smiled, though it felt shaky. "Good night, Jeremy." "Good night," he replied, his gaze lingering on me for a beat longer than necessary. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Leonard snored softly beside me. My mind was racing, replaying every word, every look, every moment of the evening. Jeremy's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve more than that." No one had ever said that to me before. Not Leonard, not anyone. And hearing it from Jeremy of all people felt both startling and comforting. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a kind gesture from someone trying to express gratitude. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The following morning I woke early, hoping to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing coffee and mentally running through the day's to-do list. Jeremy appeared in the doorway just as I was pouring my second cup. He looked tired, his hair mussed and his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, handing him a mug. He accepted it with a small smile, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. For a while, we stood there in silence, the tension between us simmering just beneath the surface. "About last night," he said finally, setting his mug down. I froze, my pulse quickening. "What about it?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly, though my voice wavered slightly. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt fragile, like it might break under the weight of everything I wasn't saying. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the garden, pruning the rose bushes that lined the edge of the yard. It was one of the few things that brought me a sense of peace, a way to quiet my restless mind. Jeremy appeared at the edge of the garden, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. "Need help?" he asked, his tone casual. I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, grab those clippers." We worked in tandem, the quiet hum of the garden filling the space between us. Every now and then, our hands brushed as we reached for the same branch, and each time I felt that same electric jolt. At one point he paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he looked around the garden. "This is nice," he said. "Peaceful." "It's my sanctuary," I admitted, glancing at him. "I can see why," he said, his gaze softening. We stood there for a moment, the sunlight filtering through the trees and casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was warm, the scent of roses heavy around us. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For everything," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "For putting up with me, for being here. I don't say it enough, but I appreciate you." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You don't have to thank me, Jeremy," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I do," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, the world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of us standing there in the garden. I could feel the warmth of his presence, the intensity of his gaze, and the weight of everything unspoken between us. "Jeremy," I began, but before I could finish, he took a step closer. "Victoria," he said, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't quite name. My breath caught, my heart pounding as I realized just how close we were standing. I should go, I said abruptly, stepping back and breaking the spell. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Yeah, me too. As I watched him walk away, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Whatever was happening between us, I knew it wasn't over. The days that followed were a blur of routine tasks and forced normalcy. But underneath it all, the air in the house felt different. Heavier. Charged. Jeremy and I danced around each other like strangers in a shared space, our conversations polite but brief, our interactions careful to the point of being stilted. I threw myself into work for the business, organizing invoices, corresponding with clients, and planning the next event. Anything to keep myself busy, to stop my mind from wandering back to the moments we had shared. But avoidance only works for so long. One morning, Leonard sat at the dining table, his coffee cup in one hand and his tablet in the other, skimming through news articles as he often did before heading off to his golf club. He glanced up at me, his expression distant but mildly curious. You seem different lately, he said, gesturing vaguely with his free hand. I froze for a fraction of a second, quickly masking my unease with a tight smile. Different how? I don't know, he replied with a shrug. Busier maybe, a little quieter. Everything okay? Of course, I lied, my tone practiced. Just a lot on my plate with the business. He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his tablet, already distracted by whatever headline had caught his attention. I envied his obliviousness. It must be nice, I thought, to live in a world where everything feels simple, where the people around you can spiral into chaos and you don't even notice. Later that afternoon, I found myself back in the garden, pruning the rose bushes that had grown unruly over the past week. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and the faint hum of bees filled the air. I was so absorbed in my task that I didn't hear Jeremy approach until he was standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. Need help again? He asked, his tone light but his expression cautious. For a moment I considered saying no. But I didn't. Sure, I said, stepping aside to make room for him. Grab the clippers. We worked in silence for a while, the tension between us palpable. Every now and then, I would catch him glancing at me out of the corner of my eye, his expression unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I straightened, turning to face him. I haven't been avoiding you, I said quickly, though even I didn't believe it. He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. Really? Because it feels like you can't even look me in the eye anymore. His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt my defenses begin to crack. It's not that simple, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Then explain it to me, he said, taking a step closer. Because I don't understand what's happening here. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The truth felt too dangerous, too messy, but I couldn't keep pretending like nothing was wrong. Jeremy, I began, but the words caught in my throat. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not trying to make this harder for you. But I can't keep walking on eggshells around you, wondering what I did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Then what is it? He pressed, his voice softer now. Why does it feel like everything's changed between us? Because it has, I wanted to say. Because I can't stop thinking about you. But I couldn't say that. Instead, I shook my head, turning away from him. I think you should leave, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What? He asked, his tone tinged with disbelief. This, I said, gesturing vaguely between us. Whatever this is, it can't happen. You need to leave before it gets worse. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. If that's what you want, he said quietly. It is, I lied. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the garden with the roses and my racing thoughts. That evening, Leonard came home earlier than usual, his mood unusually cheerful. He poured himself a drink and settled into the living room, regaling me with stories about his golf game and the friends he'd seen at the club. I nodded along, smiling in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. Jeremy didn't join us for dinner. When I asked Leonard if he'd seen him, he shrugged. Probably out with friends or something. You know how he is. But I knew better. Jeremy didn't have friends in town, Not anymore. He was avoiding me, just as I'd told him to. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in Jeremy's familiar handwriting. I'll be staying with a friend for a few days. Don't worry about me. The note was short and to the point, but it felt like a punch to the gut. I clutched it in my hands, my chest tightening as a wave of guilt washed over me. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? For him to leave? To give us both some space to figure things out? But now that he was gone, the house felt unbearably empty. It was 2 days later when I got the call. I was in the middle of organizing paperwork for an upcoming event when my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen and froze when I saw Jeremy's name. Hello? I answered, my voice trembling slightly. It's me, he said, his voice rough. I didn't know who else to call. What's wrong? I asked, my heart pounding. I'm fine, he said quickly. It's just, I had a fight with my dad. I frowned, confused. When? Earlier today, he admitted. He came to the place I'm staying and started going off about how I'm not pulling my weight, how I'm just using you to keep a roof over my head. I couldn't take it anymore. His words made my chest tighten with anger. Jeremy, that's not true, I said firmly. You've been helping out more than anyone. Try telling him that, he said bitterly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. I shouldn't have called. I just needed someone to talk to. I'm glad you did, I said softly. By the time we hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't fix everything, but I could at least try to make things right between Jeremy and Leonard. Or so I thought. Jeremy's call lingered in my mind long after we hung up. His voice, raw with frustration and exhaustion, played on repeat in my thoughts, each word laced with something I couldn't ignore. Anger, vulnerability, and a kind of loneliness that mirrored my own. Leonard, oblivious as always, went about his days as if nothing had changed. He had his routines: golf in the mornings, a scotch in the evenings, and the occasional burst of enthusiasm when a business idea struck him. He'd been home less frequently lately, throwing himself into plans for a new venture. Something about luxury short-term rentals that he thought could make him rich overnight. It's gonna be huge, he said over dinner one night, his tone animated. I've got the connections, and people are desperate for exclusive stays these days. That sounds great, I replied, my voice devoid of any real enthusiasm. He didn't notice. Jeremy's absence had created a vacuum in the house, one that Leonard seemed completely unaware of. The empty guest room and the lack of Jeremy's quiet presence in the kitchen or the garden left the house feeling cold, hollow. For me, though, it was a constant reminder of what I'd done, or failed to do. 3 days after Jeremy's call, I found him sitting on the back steps of the house when I returned from running errands. He looked tired, his hair disheveled, and his eyes shadowed with what I guessed was a lack of sleep. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. I needed to talk to you, he said, standing as I approached. I couldn't stay away any longer. Something about the way he said it made my breath catch. Jeremy, can we go inside? He asked, cutting me off. I nodded, leading him into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter as I set my bags down, his posture tense but his expression earnest. I've been thinking, he said, after a moment, his voice low, about everything, about us. Jeremy, there is no us, I said quickly, though my words felt hollow. Don't lie to me, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. We both know that's not true. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, I turned away, busying myself with unloading the groceries. This isn't fair, he said, his voice breaking the quiet. What isn't? I asked without looking at him. This, he said, gesturing vaguely, pretending like nothing's wrong, pretending like I don't feel the way I do. I froze, a can of soup still in my hand. Jeremy, you don't mean that. Yes, I do, he said firmly. I turned to face him then, my chest tightening. Do you have any idea what you're saying, what you're risking? I know exactly what I'm risking, he replied, his voice steady. But I don't care. You're worth it. His words hit me like a blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. You can't say things like that, I whispered. Why not? He challenged, stepping closer. Because it's not right, I said, my voice trembling. Because this isn't who we are. Then who are we? He asked, his voice softer now. Tell me, Victoria, who are we pretending to be? The truth was, I didn't know. The sound of the front door opening made both of us freeze. Jeremy stepped back and I turned away quickly, pretending to busy myself with the groceries. "Hey, honey," Leonard called from the hallway. "In here," I replied, my voice too bright, too forced. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, a folder tucked under his arm and a wide grin on his face. "Big news," he announced, holding up the folder. "Oh?" I asked, forcing myself to focus. "I just closed a deal on the first property for the rental venture," he said, clearly pleased with himself. "That's great," I said, my smile strained. He glanced at Jeremy, his expression shifting slightly. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. "Just stopping by," Jeremy replied smoothly, his tone neutral. "Well, don't let me interrupt," Leonard said, patting Jeremy on the shoulder as he passed. "I've got some calls to make." As soon as he left the room, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I should go," Jeremy said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That weekend, Leonard decided to host a celebratory dinner for his new business venture. He invited a few close friends, insisting that Jeremy and I both attend. "You're part of the family," Leonard said to Jeremy when he hesitated. "And you've been a big help around here. You deserve to be included." Jeremy agreed reluctantly, and I found myself dreading the evening. The dinner started off uneventfully, with Leonard dominating the conversation as usual. He talked at length about his plans for the business, his confidence filling the room like a tangible presence. Jeremy, seated across from me, was quiet but attentive, his gaze occasionally meeting mine in moments that felt too charged, too dangerous. "Jeremy's been a real asset around here," Leonard said at one point, raising his glass. "I don't say it enough, but I'm proud of you, son." Jeremy's expression hardened, and I saw the tension in his jaw as he forced a smile. "Thanks," he said, though his tone was clipped. The night took a turn when Leonard, emboldened by a few too many drinks, decided to wax nostalgic about the past. "You know, Victoria," he said, his words slightly slurred, "when I married you, I wasn't sure how Jeremy would take it. But I think you've done a damn good job keeping this family together." I froze, my cheeks flushing as everyone turned to look at me. "And Jeremy," Leonard continued, oblivious to the awkwardness in the room, "I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done lately. You're finally starting to make something of yourself." Jeremy's expression darkened, and I saw the storm brewing in his eyes. "I've always been something, Dad," he said, his voice low but firm. "You just never noticed." The room fell silent, and Leonard frowned, clearly taken aback. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't get to take credit for my progress," Jeremy said, his voice rising. "That's all me. Not you." The tension in the room was unbearable, and I found myself gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. "Jeremy," I said softly, trying to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. "You've spent your whole life taking people for granted," Jeremy continued, his gaze locked on Leonard, "and I'm done pretending like it doesn't matter." Leonard opened his mouth to respond, but Jeremy stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice tight. "Jeremy, wait," I said, standing as well. But he was already walking away, leaving the room in stunned silence. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. The anger in Jeremy's voice, the pain in his eyes, it was all too much. Leonard, of course, brushed it off. "He's always been emotional," he said dismissively. "He'll calm down." But I wasn't so sure. And as the hours ticked by, I realized that things between us, between all of us, could never go back to the way they were. It wasn't supposed to happen. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting in an empty office, drenched in guilt and adrenaline, staring into the eyes of my 23-year-old stepson as thunder raged outside, I would have laughed. But that night, something shifted. Something I still can't fully explain. The storm had started innocently enough. The office was almost deserted by 7 p.m., with only the hum of computers and the occasional buzz of a text message breaking the silence. I'd been glued to my desk, finishing up project reports that were due the next morning. Across the room, Evan sat at his workstation, headphones on, fingers flying over his keyboard as he debugged the game we'd been pouring months of work into. Evan had joined the company a little over a year ago, fresh out of college. He was talented, more so than most junior developers I'd worked with. It didn't hurt that he was charming, with an easy smile and a self-assuredness that most young men lacked. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that drew people in without trying too hard. He was also my stepson. When Evan moved in with us after college, I didn't think much of it. I'd been married to his father, Dean, for over a decade, and though we weren't exactly close, I'd always tried to be a good stepmom. But living together, and then working together, blurred the lines in ways I hadn't anticipated. That night, the storm hit harder than anyone expected. The sky outside was a black sheet, lit up occasionally by jagged streaks of lightning. Rain lashed against the windows, and the office power flickered ominously. By the time I realized how bad it was, the streets were already flooding. "I think we're stuck here," Evan said, pulling off his headphones and leaning back in his chair. His voice was calm, as if being stranded in an empty office during a storm was no big deal. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m. "The news says the roads are completely flooded," I replied, scrolling through my phone. "It's not safe to drive right now." "Well," he said with a grin, "looks like it's just you and me." There was nothing particularly suggestive in his tone, but something about the way his eyes lingered on mine made my stomach tighten. I looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the screen in front of me. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the room became palpable. We talked about work at first, discussing deadlines and game mechanics, but the conversation eventually drifted to more personal topics. "I don't know how you do it," Evan said, breaking the silence. "Do what?" "Juggle all this. Work, life at home, dealing with my dad." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "It's not as seamless as it looks." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You make it look easy. I mean, honestly, you're the only reason this project hasn't completely fallen apart. Everyone knows that." His words caught me off guard. Compliments from Evan weren't new. He was naturally warm and expressive. But this felt different. There was something deeper in his tone, something that made my pulse quicken. "Thank you," I said, avoiding his gaze. "That means a lot." Another crack of thunder rattled the windows, and the power cut out completely. The room plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of our monitors. "Great," I muttered, feeling my way toward the nearest desk drawer for a flashlight. "Wait," Evan said, and I heard him get up. A moment later, his hand brushed against mine, guiding me toward a chair. "Sit. I'll find the flashlight." His touch was brief but electric. I sat down, my heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm. When he returned, the small beam of the flashlight illuminated his face. He looked different in the dim light. Softer. No venode. He handed me the flashlight, but instead of stepping back, he stayed close, his knee brushing against mine. "I've always admired you, he said quietly. I froze. "Evan?" "No, let me say this." His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made my chest tighten. "You've been nothing but kind to me since the day I moved in. You're strong, smart, and honestly, you're the most amazing person I've ever met." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, trying to find a way to diffuse the situation, but my body betrayed me. My breath hitched, and my hands gripped the edge of the chair as his words settled over me like a warm blanket. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the sterile office air. This isn't right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Because of my dad? Because we work together?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt hollow. Evan knelt down in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. The flashlight's beam wavered, casting shifting shadows across the room. "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you feel it too." I couldn't answer. I didn't trust myself to speak. The storm outside roared louder, but inside everything was still. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. His lips brushed against mine. Tentative at first, then more confident when I didn't pull away. The kiss was soft and slow, but it ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The sound of rain pounding against the windows faded into the background as I let myself get lost in the moment. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, as the weight of everything, my marriage, my role as his stepmother, the risk of being caught, melted away. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. It started months before that night in the storm. Looking back now, I can see all the little moments that led to it, all the quiet shifts in how I saw him. At the time, though, I didn't think much of them. I told myself they were harmless, fleeting thoughts that didn't mean anything. But they did. When Evan joined the company, I was proud of him. I'd seen his talent long before anyone else did. Dean had always dismissed Evan's passion for video games as a waste of time, but I saw the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the worlds he wanted to create. I pushed Dean to put in a good word for him with a colleague, which eventually led to Evan landing the job. At work, though, he wasn't my stepson. He was just another member of my team, a promising junior developer who happened to share my last name. I thought keeping things professional would be easy, but I underestimated how much time we'd spend together. It started innocently enough. Late nights in the office, huddled over computer screens as we worked through bugs and brainstormed ideas for the game. Evan was sharp and creative, and his enthusiasm was contagious. He'd come up with ideas that no one else had thought of, and I couldn't help but admire him for it. One night, about 3 months before the storm, we were the last 2 people in the office. It was close to midnight, and most of the lights had been turned off. I was reviewing design documents at my desk when Evan walked over with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you need this," he said, placing one in front of me. "Lifesaver," I said with a tired smile, taking a sip. It was perfect. Black, just the way I liked it. "How do you do it?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my desk. "Do what?" "Keep everything together. The deadlines, the meetings, the endless demands. If it were me, I'd probably lose it." I shrugged. "You get used to it. It helps to have a good team." "You mean me?" he said with a teasing grin. I laughed. "Don't push your luck." But the truth was, he wasn't wrong. Evan had become my go-to person for last-minute fixes and creative solutions. He worked harder than anyone else on the team, and he never complained. As the weeks went on, I started to notice little things. The way he'd linger at my desk a little longer than necessary. The way his eyes would light up when I praised his work. The way he'd find excuses to talk to me, even when it wasn't about the project. At first, I chalked it up to his natural charm. Evan had always been good at making people feel special. It was one of the reasons he was so well liked. But then there were moments that felt different. One evening, we were reviewing a cutscene for the game in the conference room. The lights were dimmed, and the glow from the projector cast shadows across the walls. Evan leaned over my shoulder to point out something on the screen, his arm brushing against mine. "See that?" he said, his voice low. "The lighting needs to be adjusted here. It's too harsh." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. I was too aware of how close he was, the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth of his body next to mine. "Claire?" I blinked, realizing he was waiting for a response. "Right. The lighting. I'll make a note of it." He didn't move right away, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something else. But then he stepped back, leaving me feeling oddly unsettled. After that, I started to catch myself looking at him more often. I'd noticed the way his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing toned forearms, or the way his smile would reach his eyes, making him look younger and more carefree. It wasn't just at work, either. At home, I found myself paying more attention to him during dinner. The way he'd laugh at my jokes, even when they weren't that funny. The way he'd ask about my day, and actually listen to the answer. Dean rarely did that anymore. One weekend, Dean went on a business trip, leaving Evan and me alone in the house. I tried to keep my distance, spending most of my time in my office, but Evan had other plans. "Hey," he said, knocking on my door. "I'm making dinner. You hungry?" I hesitated. "You're cooking?" "Don't sound so surprised," he said with a grin. "I'm not completely useless in the kitchen." I followed him downstairs, where he'd set up an impressive spread: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of wine. "Where did you learn to do all this?" I asked as I sat down at the table. "College," he said, pouring us both a glass of wine. "Had to fend for myself, remember?" The meal was delicious, but it wasn't the food that stuck with me. It was the way he looked at me across the table, his eyes lingering just a little too long. It was the way his hand brushed against mine when he reached for the wine bottle. It was the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, wondering if I was imagining things. Was I reading too much into his actions? Or was there something real between us? I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself they were ridiculous. He was my stepson. I was his father's wife. Whatever I was feeling, it was wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. The lines were starting to blur. The night of the storm had shaken me to my core, but it wasn't the first time I'd felt the pull toward Evan. It wasn't even the first time something had happened between us that crossed the line of propriety. About a month before the storm, there had been a work trip. Our team had been sent to a gaming convention in San Diego to showcase an early build of our project. Dean had barely noticed when I told him I'd be gone for a few days. He was too wrapped up in his latest trial to care. The trip started off normal enough. Long days at the convention booth, answering endless questions from attendees and industry professionals. Evan and I were part of a small team that traveled together, along with Jessica and 2 others from our department. During the day, I kept things professional, but the tension between Evan and me was undeniable. The hotel we stayed in was upscale, but there was a mix-up at check-in. They'd overbooked, and instead of separate rooms, Evan and I were assigned a shared suite. Jessica immediately teased us about it, smirking as she handed me the room key. "Well, this should be interesting," she said, her eyes flicking between me and Evan. "It's just one night," I said, brushing it off. "We'll manage." But I was already nervous. Sharing a space with him felt dangerous, like walking a tightrope over a canyon. The suite was spacious, with 2 beds separated by a small sitting area, but it still felt too intimate. I could feel the weight of his presence, even when he was on the other side of the room. That evening, after a long day at the convention, we both collapsed in the suite, too tired to even think about going out for dinner. I ordered room service, a bottle of wine, and a couple of burgers, and we ate in comfortable silence, the glow of the city lights streaming in through the windows. "This is nice," Evan said, leaning back on the couch. He'd kicked off his shoes and loosened his tie, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. Not the sharing a room part, obviously, but just hanging out. I smiled, sipping my wine. "It is." We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. He told me stories from college, wild parties, late-night gaming marathons, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. At some point, I realized how late it had gotten. The clock on the bedside table read 1:12 a.m., and the room had grown quiet. "I should probably get some sleep," I said, standing up. Evan nodded, but there was a look in his eyes that made my stomach flutter. He stood too, stepping closer, and suddenly the space between us felt impossibly small. "Claire," he said, his voice low and uncertain. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "This is crazy," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe," he said, his eyes searching mine. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I didn't have a chance to respond before he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a tentative kiss. For a split second, I thought about pulling away. But then his hands found my waist, and the kiss deepened, and every ounce of resolve I'd built up over the months melted away. I don't know how long we stood there, tangled in each other, but eventually I pulled back, breathless and shaking. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely audible. He nodded, but his hands didn't leave my waist. "I know, but I don't want to stop." Neither did I. That night, nothing more happened. I made him promise we'd keep things professional, and he agreed, though I could see the frustration in his eyes. I told myself that was the end of it, that the kiss had been a mistake we'd never repeat. But I was wrong. The night of the storm, that promise shattered completely. After the power went out and Evan kissed me in the office, something inside me broke. I couldn't stop myself, couldn't resist the pull I felt toward him any longer. We didn't talk about it. There were no words, no rationalizations. He lifted me onto the desk, and suddenly everything that had been building between us for months came rushing to the surface. His touch was firm but gentle. his hands exploring in ways that made my breath hitch. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it felt like time had stopped. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, made my chest ache. I hadn't felt that way in so long, hadn't realized how much I missed being wanted. Afterward, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd done settling over us. I could see the worry in his eyes, the same fear I felt twisting in my stomach. "We shouldn't have done that," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, reaching for my hand, "but I don't regret it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't regret it either, and that terrified me. The storm eventually passed, and so did the night. But something fundamental had changed between us, something we couldn't take back. From that moment on, the line we'd crossed wasn't just blurred, it was gone entirely. The days after the storm blurred into a haze of adrenaline and guilt. Evan and I tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the weight of our secret followed us everywhere. At work, at home, even in the fleeting moments we managed to steal together. I told myself it would stop, that what had happened in the office that night had been a one-time mistake. But the truth was, I didn't want to stop, and neither did Evan. It wasn't long before we found ourselves falling into a dangerous routine. At the office, we maintained our professional distance during the day, careful not to draw attention to ourselves. But late at night, when most of the team had gone home, we found excuses to stay behind. The small storage room down the hall became our haven. A cramped, dimly lit space filled with old computers and forgotten office supplies. The door locked from the inside, and no one ever had a reason to go in there. It was where we could let our guard down, even if just for a few stolen moments. It was in that room that I realized just how much Evan affected me. The way he'd look at me, his eyes dark with intensity, made me forget everything else. The way he touched me, like I was something precious, made my chest ache with feelings I didn't want to name. But as careful as we tried to be, it was impossible to keep everything hidden. One evening, I was heading to the storage room, my heart pounding with both anticipation and dread, when I nearly ran into Jessica in the hallway. "Burning the midnight oil again?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just wrapping up a few things," I said, forcing a smile. Jessica studied me for a moment, her eyes sharp and calculating. "You've been staying late a lot lately. So has Evan. Funny how that works, huh?" I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. "We've been working on the same project," I said, keeping my tone light. "Deadlines are brutal." She didn't sound convinced. Jessica had always been perceptive, almost annoyingly so. She was the kind of person who thrived on office gossip, and I knew she wasn't above digging for dirt if she thought there was something worth finding. I tried to brush off her comment, but the encounter left me on edge. At home, things were even more complicated. Dean's work kept him busy, which should have made it easier to hide what was happening. But the tension between Evan and me was impossible to ignore. One evening, Dean and I were sitting at the dining table, eating dinner in near silence. Evan was upstairs in his room, supposedly working on something for the project. "How's everything going with the game?" Dean asked, his tone distracted. "It's fine," I said, focusing on my plate. He looked up, frowning slightly. "You've been spending a lot of late nights at the office." "There's a lot to do," I said quickly. "You know how these projects are." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. I felt like I was under a microscope, every move I made scrutinized. Later that night, I found Evan in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water. "Your dad's starting to notice," I said softly, keeping my voice low. Evan set the glass down and stepped closer. "He doesn't notice anything unless it's work-related." "That's not true," I said, even though I knew it was. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "We'll be careful." I wanted to believe him, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. The turning point came a week later. It was late on a Friday night, and Dean was away on another business trip. Evan and I had spent the evening on opposite sides of the house, deliberately avoiding each other. But as the hours dragged on, the pull between us became impossible to resist. I found him in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a video game controller in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said, setting the controller down. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. And then he stood, crossing the room in a few quick strides. His hands found my waist, and before I could protest, his lips were on mine. It was reckless and stupid, but I couldn't stop myself. I kissed him back, pouring weeks of pent-up frustration and longing into that one moment. We didn't hear the car pulling into the driveway. Dean wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday, but when the sound of the front door opening reached us, panic set in. Go, I whispered, shoving Evan toward the hallway. He disappeared upstairs just as Dean walked into the living room, his briefcase in hand. Claire, he said, looking surprised. What are you doing up? I could ask you the same thing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The meeting wrapped up early, so I caught a flight home, he said, studying me with a frown. You look flustered. I was just tidying up, I lied, gesturing vaguely toward the coffee table. Dean didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The near miss left me rattled. For the first time, I truly understood how much I had to lose. But even that wasn't enough to stop me. Jessica's suspicion grew, her sharp comments becoming more frequent. Dean's mood shifted too, his conversations with me more pointed, as if he was searching for something I wasn't telling him. And through it all, Evan and I couldn't stay away from each other. Every stolen kiss, every secret touch, felt like a risk worth taking, even as the walls closed in around us. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. By the time everything came to a head, the cracks in my life were impossible to ignore. My marriage to Dean, my career, my relationship with Evan, they were all teetering on the edge of collapse. Every step I took felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I fell. The breaking point came one Friday night. Dean and I were having dinner, the silence between us heavier than usual. For weeks he'd been distant. Not the usual, distracted by work kind of distant, but something else. It felt like suspicion. I think we need to talk, Dean said suddenly, breaking the silence. My fork froze mid-air. About what? About us. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. Something's been off lately. You've been different. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. Different how? You're distant. You're always at work, always distracted when you're home. You barely even talk to me anymore. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Is there someone else? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment I couldn't speak. What? No, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Of course not. Dean didn't look convinced. Then what's going on, Claire? Because something's not right. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The guilt was suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I don't know what you want me to say, I finally managed, pushing back my chair and standing. I'm tired. I think I'm just going to go to bed. Dean didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked away. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Dean's words kept echoing in my head. Is there someone else? The answer was yes, of course. But it wasn't just anyone. It was Evan. My stepson. The guilt was almost unbearable, but so was the thought of letting Evan go. The next day, I avoided both of them. Dean left for work early, and I spent most of the morning locked in my home office, pretending to be buried in emails. Evan was downstairs, but I didn't trust myself to be alone with him. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that I heard a knock at my door. Claire? Evan's voice was soft but insistent. I hesitated before opening the door. His expression was serious, his brows drawn together in concern. What's going on? He asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Nothing, I said quickly, looking away. Don't lie to me. He reached out, gently tilting my chin so I had to meet his eyes. I can tell something's wrong. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess how scared I was, how guilty I felt, how torn I was between him and the life I'd built with his father. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I said, Your dad thinks there's something going on. Evan's jaw tightened. Does he know? No, but he's suspicious. And Jessica, she's been making comments too. He nodded, his hand dropping to his side. We'll be more careful. Evan, that's not the point. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know how much longer I can do this. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue. But then he said, I don't want to lose you. The raw emotion in his voice broke something inside me. I reached out, pulling him into a hug. He held me tightly, his chin resting on the top of my head. I don't want to lose you either, I whispered. For the first time, I let myself admit how much he meant to me. This wasn't just physical. It hadn't been for a long time. That night, everything came to a head. Dean was working late, and Evan and I were home alone. We tried to keep our distance, but the tension between us was unbearable. Eventually, I found him in the living room, pacing back and forth. Evan, I said, and he turned to face me. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice breaking. Pretending like nothing's happening. Pretending like I don't care. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. What are you saying? I love you, Claire, he said, his eyes shining with emotion. I know how wrong this is. I know what's at stake. But I can't help it. I love you. His words hit me like a freight train. I'd been trying to avoid thinking about what this all meant, about how deep my feelings for him had grown. But hearing him say it out loud made it impossible to ignore. I love you too, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The moment the words left my mouth, he was in front of me, his hands on my face, his lips crashing against mine. This kiss was different, desperate, full of all the emotions we'd been holding back for so long. We didn't hear the door open. Dean's voice cut through the room like a knife. What the hell is going on here? We broke apart, spinning toward him. His face was a mix of shock and fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Dean, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. I knew something was going on, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't want to believe it, but now... He shook his head, his eyes narrowing at Evan. Get out! Evan hesitated, his jaw tightening. I said get out. Dean roared, his voice echoing through the room. Evan turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, he whispered before walking out the door. After he left, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. Dean and I stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between us. I trusted you, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry, I said, tears streaming down my face. I never meant for this to happen. But the damage was done. The days after that night felt like a slow-motion car crash. Everything I'd worked so hard to build, my marriage, my career, my carefully maintained facade, had shattered, and I was left standing in the ruins. Dean didn't speak to me for 3 days. He didn't come to bed, didn't sit down to eat, didn't even look at me. He spent most of his time in his home office, the door locked, the hum of his phone calls with clients seeping into the hallways like a distant reminder of the life we'd pretended to have. Evan was gone. He packed a bag the night of the confrontation and left without saying goodbye. I didn't know where he went. He wasn't answering my texts, and I didn't dare call him. Dean's fury was still fresh, and any contact with Evan would have only made things worse. At work, the tension was unbearable. Jessica had clearly noticed something was wrong. She watched me closely during meetings, her sharp eyes darting between me and the empty chair Evan had once occupied. His absence hadn't gone unnoticed by the rest of the team either. Rumors started to swirl. He'd left the company suddenly, no explanation, no goodbye. Rough week? Jessica said one morning as we waited for the elevator. I forced a tight smile. Something like that. Her smirk told me she wasn't buying it. By Friday, Dean finally broke the silence. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee, when he walked in. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, his tie loose around his neck. He sat down across from me, his movements slow and deliberate, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I want to know everything, he said finally, his voice low and strained. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling around the coffee mug. Dean, No excuses, he interrupted, his gaze cutting through me like a blade. I need to hear the truth, all of it. And so I told him. I told him about the late nights at work, the stolen moments, the feelings I hadn't meant to have. I told him about the storm, about the hotel on the work trip, about every reckless decision that had led us to this point. By the time I finished, Dean's face was pale, his jaw tight. How long? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Months, I admitted, my chest tightening with shame. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I trusted you. I trusted him. How could you do this? I didn't have an answer. That night, Dean packed a bag and left. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back. He just walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too empty. I spent the next few days in a fog. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, but it all felt meaningless. The only thing I could think about was Evan. Where was he? Was he okay? Did he hate me for everything that had happened? I finally broke down and called him. The phone rang, and just when I thought he wouldn't pick up, I heard his voice. Claire. The sound of his name hit me like a wave. Evan, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry. There was a long pause. Where are you? At home, I said, my voice trembling. I'll come by, he said, and the line went dead. When Evan showed up that evening, he looked different, tired, older somehow. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something heavier, more serious. I didn't want to leave, he said as soon as he walked in. But after what happened, I didn't know what else to do. I understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything we'd been through pressing down on us. I can't stop thinking about you, he said finally, his voice breaking. Even after everything, I can't let you go. Tears welled up in my eyes. Evan, this isn't fair to you, to anyone. We've ruined so much. I don't care, he said, stepping closer. I don't care about the fallout or the consequences. I care about you. His words shattered what little resolve I had left. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my arms wrapping around him. For a moment it felt like nothing else mattered. Just him and me, holding on to each other like our lives depended on it. But the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke up to find Evan sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. We can't keep doing this, he said quietly. I sat up, my heart sinking. Evan. No, listen, he said, turning to face me. I love you, Claire, but this isn't sustainable. It's hurting everyone around us, it's hurting you. Tears filled my eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to stop. His words felt like a knife to my chest, but deep down I knew he was right. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Dean filed for a separation, and Evan left the company for good. I stayed in the house, surrounded by the ghosts of everything we'd lost. I thought about Evan every day, wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he was thinking about me too. Sometimes I'd catch myself hoping he'd show up at my door, that we'd find a way to make it work despite everything. But he never did. Months later, I saw him again. It was at a coffee shop downtown, a chance encounter that felt both surreal and inevitable. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own. Hi, he said softly. Hi. We sat down together, and for a while we just talked, about work, about life, about everything and nothing. When it was time to go, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I'll always love you, he said quietly. I'll always love you too, I replied. And then he walked away, leaving me with the bittersweet knowledge that some things are too complicated, too messy, to ever have a happy ending.